Thanks for inviting me, and thanks for putting me at this place in the program, because my presentation comes neatly after the one we've just had in some ways. Though, let me also say I'm certainly also not a historian, and what I'm going to talk about here is not historical. It is very contemporary. It is also it is not primarily a theoretical treatment. There's of course a theoretical argument, but it is primarily argued empirically. So it differs in a number of ways from what we've heard so far. I'm interested in forms of exploitation, and that is why I say it fits neatly in here. And what I'm going to look at is, as we can see here, unfree labor relations today. Now, why do that? There's, of course, this is always intrinsically, and to me certainly, an interesting and an important issue, but it's also an issue that is very much put to the fore within the mainstream thinking, within social science and within activism, and there are reasons for that, and it's often linked to international migration and the conditions of international migrants being unfree in some sense, and of course that is very much part of the labor regimes that exist today, that kind of the role of international migrants taking up the worst conditions within labor regimes. It is often tied in with global commodity or value chains, where it's argued that at the bottom of the chains we have unfree laborers working under appalling conditions. And it's a point that has been pushed quite dramatically by a number of different activist organizations, from the neoliberal Walk Free Foundation that talks about slavery, modern slavery or slavery, by the ILO, and also by more progressive organizations such as anti-slavery and others. And it is a topic that is high on, has shot up the academic agenda as well, and the funders' agenda as well. There are many research projects on aspects of unfree labor, either in relation to migration or in other ways. So that is sort of well, it is up in times, one may say. So what I'll do here today is I'll discuss this in relation to the, shall we say, standard Marxist and left way of thinking about this, which is actually quite broad, which is the idea that unfree labor relations are very much present today in a number of particular areas, those areas that I've just discussed in particular. And I will argue that that is not the most useful way of thinking of this. I will take a much narrower approach. I maintain that unfreedom exists, slaves, cattle slaves exist, there are long-term serf-like conditions, etc. But that is the only, it is those kind of areas that one should reserve the term unfreedom for, and not just spread it out across a number of other labor relations. That of course also means that unfree labor becomes less politically important in our analysis of neoliberalism, that I'm very comfortable with. I think the focus should be elsewhere than on forced labor or on unfree labor. I think the overall conditions of the working class, the rights of workers in general, is a much better approach to looking actually also of degrees of unfreedoms. And this also represents a change in my own views. I have written on these topics earlier, and I have previously suggested a combination of a focus on on this broad kind of on freedom and on overall labor regimes. Now I'm shifting more towards a stronger focus on labor regimes, as you will see. Okay, so, but in order to start any discussions about unfreedom, one has to go back to what is the relationship between capitalism and unfree labor. One has to start with Marx's Marx pointing out that doubly free labor is paradigmatic under capitalism, is dominant under capitalism. Labor must be freed from the means of access to the means of production, and also free to commodify, free to sell labor power to different employers. Now, that has for long been seen as a problem in relation to accepting unfreedom under capitalism. And there are different solutions to that. One is to relegate any kind of unfree labor to pre-capitalism, so therefore if it exists today, it is vestiges of pre-capitalism. But a much more useful approach, and probably the versions of this being the standard approach today, is the one that Jairus Banadi puts so neatly back in 2003, that it depends on what level we're looking at the level of total social capital, a systemic level of capitalism. Capitalism does indeed presuppose doubly free labor, but there are different forms of surplus appropriation, different forms of exploitation that coexist at the level of individual capital. So that is also the stance I'm taking here and trying to take forward here. That in that formulation there is maybe a possibility of looking at the individual level, of individual level of capital as something that is not structural, something that is a coincidence, and I think it's important to say that is not how Jairus treats it. It is still it still has its structural underpinnings, and that is a classic argument within left thinking around unfree labor relations under capitalism as well. So that is unfreedom in the sense of whether labor is doubly free or not. But Jairus also put forward another important point, namely that freedom under capitalism is relative. Now, he talks about more or less unfree labor, a point that also van der Linden points out that Marx really supports by saying that wage labor is indirect forced labor. So the idea that there's a continuum of different degrees of freedom is well grounded. Here, though, it is there are two aspects of this. It can either be seen as degrees of commodification of labor. Is it so that labor is always either free or unfree? Are there degrees within that? It can also be degrees of whether within the level of a total social capital there are degrees of freedoms, degrees of oppression. So those two levels, I think, always have to be present in our thinking around freedom. Now, how do we then look at freedom under capitalism? Probably the most one of the most well-known Marxist theories of unfreedom under capitalism is that of Tom Brass. Tom Brass argues that unfreedom equals deep proletarianization of labor. That when labor is not doubly free, then in itself that halts class in itself formation. So labor is not in a position to even think of itself and to act in any way as a class. This was a thesis he developed, but originally in relation to empirical work in agriculture in India, and it is a thesis that, in a sense, he wasn't the first to understand empirically. Jan Breman had for decades before looked at this as well, conceptualized this as seasonal debt bondage, and argued that this was a type of capitalist relations that was characterized by nothing but straightforward exploitation, no patron-client aspects, but simply exploitation based on workers being forced into taking out an upfront loan and then having to work until the loan had been paid off, and on top of that not being paid till the end of the season. So that within a year a laborer that were in debt bondage would be forced throughout the year to stay with the same employer because of that, and often this loan relation would continue year on year on year on year. So clearly oppressive labor relation during the work period. And it's those three issues: entry, exit, and conditions during the work period, that are the three standard issues that are dealt with in the literature on this kind of unfree labor. So that means that if we're looking at this from the angle of capital, debt relations would cheapen labor, would discipline labor, that would ensure a workforce was available throughout the season. This way of looking at unfree labor relations and claiming that this is an unfree labor relation, debt-based unfree labor relation, is quite standard within both Marxist and mainstream thinking. This is seen as unfree. Similarly, and I won't talk about this because there's no time to this, similarly are the hyper-precarious international labor migration relations seen as inherently unfree for a variety of reasons, either because of tie-ins to employers or because of no rights of that migrants have no rights. So both in relation to the actual labor relation and to society as large is the argument there. The trouble with this kind of argument is that, in my view, it doesn't correspond to actual reality. This kind of unfreedom, debt-based relationship is very far removed from the cattle slavery or serfdom that is linked to analytically. And so that is an issue. Why do we lump them together? Firstly, the debt-based relation is overwhelmingly a temporary tie-in, and that is worth just dwelling on that, because very often debt relations, debt bondage is claimed to last forever, for lifetimes, etc., etc. In the part of the world where debt-based tie-ins are most common, in South Asia, in India in particular, this is simply not the case anymore. There are cases where it exists, but study after study shows that debt-based relations are seasonal only. And that, I argue, is simply not much of a tie-in, and it does not deproletarianize labor to any significant degree. And one can make the same argument about the hyper-precarious international migration, but I'm not going to do that. So also I'll argue that these kind of relations, because inherent in this is that unfree labor is the worst that can happen to labor. Actually, that is not how laborers see this themselves. There are worse free relationships than these, and there are some unfree labor relations that labor would happily take on because they see them as relatively good labor relations. So there's a discrepancy there as well. And so overall, I see little reason to lump them all together with slavery. I'll develop this argument in relation to India, which is an important case because it has the highest number of dead slaves in the world, and it is also where lots of the theory has been developed around this. Now, I'll just throw some various brief evidence at you here. Firstly, if we look at labor relations in general in India, then it's overwhelmingly, labor is overwhelmingly informal. It is also overwhelmingly based on internal seasonal migrants. 100 million workers a year, and a huge share of the labor force are seasonal internal migrants. I myself and Al-Pasha have been arguing that they were seen as super exploited, the seasonal internal migrants. This is the term we borrow from Meersu, and it's also in line with where Burawoy looked at migrant labor in the 1970s. Essentially, capital use seasonal migrants because it can get away with not paying for their reproduction, or as it's called today, social reproduction. That argument was developed back in the 70s, that therefore seasonal migrants are much cheaper than local workers that would demand some sort of wage that could also cover for their reproduction. Of course, Meersu then links this to different modes of production, etc. I think one can take this argument without going into ideas of domestic modes of production. So not only is the informal labor force to a large extent consisting of seasonal internal migrants, but also within that the labor force is segregated along lines of caste and tribe, with the lowest castes, the lowest tribes, right at the bottom of both the social hierarchy, but also of the labor hierarchy when they migrate. So they are. So labor market is being kept neatly and tidy, separated into chunks along lines of these kind of identities. Conditions are of course horrible. I mean, that's 10, 15 hours work, low pay, extreme piece rate system, etc., etc., etc. Now, if we're looking at these kind of seasonal laborers, again, we haven't come to the so-called unfree laborers. We're simply looking at standard laborers. Then they are they suffer from a number of unfreedoms or absences of rights. Firstly, unionization is practically impossible. Any attempt to take action, attempts to take action or organizing are dealt with both at workplace, in housing estates, when people go shopping, there are spies that will report, that is well documented. There's a strict control of the labor, and if need be, police will step in. There are cases, I put Manasar south of Delhi in here, which is a case where there are still 17 people jailed for lifetime, apparently for having killed a labor manager. Of course, it is all judicial conspiracy. There's no proper evidence, but that is what happens when people take strike action. They will be put to jail, and the system will work to maintain that. laborers are most often hired through labor contractors, so they have not even got a final employer that they can take, that are legally, that they can hold legally responsible. And on top of that, laborers, because they're migrants, are also discriminated against by not having the same rights as local laborers, access to cheap food, to childcare, to local elections, etc., etc. They are second-class citizens, both outside and inside the labor relation. It is within that overall picture one has to think of debt-bonded laborers. So what does it add to them that they are also hired through upfront loans and being paid at the end of the year? Well, so the argument is, does that create more unfreedom, significantly more unfreedom? It happens across a whole range of sectors in India. The loans is a common system. So is end of year payment within construction, brick kilns, harvesting work, etc. Now, I would say no. It by and large doesn't lead to much closer tie-in. Firstly, the loans aren't as big as they used to be. Loans are now normally less than a month's pay, sometimes 2 months' pay. That doesn't tie you in to any significant degree. Secondly, I'm running out of time, of course. So there are cases where it's different, but by and large, that is the situation. The fact that wages are paid at the end of the year does, of course, tie you in more. But that is also common across disciplines. One should also not forget that in most cases, workers manage to take home at the end of the year a lump sum of pay, and I can give you figures of this that we've done. I've been in charge of a research project that looked at garment and construction in Delhi. Alessandro was in charge of the garment part. Sarastra from JNU was in part of the construction part. Both show that significant take-home pay at the end of the job, to the tune of 2 to 3 months' pay. So these are people that are supposed to be, that for some are debt-bonded laborers. And most importantly, while in general labor struggles is extremely difficult in India, they do take place. They do take place in various different ways, and they also take place for debt-bonded laborers. So there's a good deal of evidence and a good deal of activists that work with debt-bonded laborers in, for example, the brick kiln sectors, where they organize people, where they take action, and where they win strikes. There's evidence across West and Northwest of India of these kind of actions, both within brick kilns and within construction. So that to me shows that the deproletarianization thesis is not working. This was what deproletarianization should ensure didn't happen. It does happen. People can take action in spite of working under a tie-in. It's not easy. It's not easy for anyone in India to do so. 2 minutes left. Yes. Labor in India is clearly not a standard proletariat. Labor has still got one foot in the agrarian economy, as well as being seasonal labor. There's little to show that will change in the foreseeable future. So, in a sense, the whole idea of deproletarianization also doesn't make sense. Labor is not proletarianized in a classic sense. That is reading off a way of thinking about labor from a different place. That doesn't mean that labor suffer from false consciousness, isn't aware of its own exploitation. I haven't got time to go through this here, but there are plenty of examples of debt-bonded laborers being very aware of their conditions and being aware of the class relations and caste oppression that they suffer under. They choose these jobs because they are better than staying back in the village and being directly oppressed by the old landowners, and these jobs also secure continuous work throughout the year, whereas if, for example, they chose to be casual laborers, they would earn more every day, but over a year they would tend to earn less, or not more, because there will be less working day a year. So this is a way, it's a choice they make every year. Should we go for the work that ensures employment, or should we go for the one that maybe gives them more freedom to also go home if they need to do so during the year, but pays but involves less work over the year. They would, if they could, they would any day choose to go to the Gulf under the extreme conditions that workers work under there, because it's paid so much better. That is seen as those low-caste workers from the villages that make it to the Gulf have made it. And you can see it also by way of the amount of money they bring back, they have made it. So the idea of this being extreme and extremely different from other labor relations simply doesn't work well. To me, that means that the focus of the analysis and the focus of the politics has to be at the overall oppressive labor regime, the exploitation of seasonal migrant laborers. And of course, that is what matters the most. Of course, it is also useful to know whether workers are tied in various other ways, but that is not what leads to the curtailing of the rights to organize and to the absence of wider rights in society of labor. That is related at the level of the general labor regime, at the general societal level. To me, that means that it is not useful to lump this together with those categories that actually are properly unfree. There are proper slaves. There are people that are forced at gunpoint. There are people that would be locked in at night. There are also unfreedom based on patriarchal relation, where women also, as Sandra has studied, in garment chains, are forced to work not because of loans, but because of the patriarchal relation within the households. There are other types of unfreedoms that matters, but that relation is not a central one. That means that when we're looking at this, to me, the main concern, both analytically and politically, has to be the general unfreedom of very oppressive labor relations. That is where the degrees of unfreedom matters. There is also real unfreedom of slavery, but this focus on unfree labor relations here exemplified by debt bondage, but we could also have taken international migration and discussed that in similar ways. That is useful, but it is not the main focus. It also means that if we return to the mainstream of slavery discourse, it is actually quite important to criticize that, and to criticize the present focus on social auditing of supply chains that takes the focus away from labor relations into a technical issue of whether there's debts or no debts in a particular relation. And one should also avoid projects such as the Nottingham-based Fighting Slavery from Space, which claims that any brick kiln equivalates slavery. All people within the brick kilns are slaves. That is the extreme version of the debt bondage argument. On top of that, many people in brick kilns do not even take out loans. But so I think also to avoid going down that route, it is extra important to focus at the general level of the question instead. Thanks.